Snow was falling thickly across the Montana plains. White across the horizon, the wind was tearing through the rows of stables and barns, making a cold, hollow sound. Like winter, the wood on the eaves creaked. No one went outside unless they had to. No one stood in the storm except those who had nowhere else to go. And then she appeared. A slender figure crossed the farmyard. Her shoulders weighed down by the snow that had accumulated on her frayed coat, torn at the elbows. Her gloves were not the same one, was an old grey wool. The other, a brown leather with cracks. Each step left a clear mark in the frozen mud. So cold that the heels of her shoes made a soft cracking sound. But she did not stop. She did not shiver. She did not bow her head. On her shoulder was a canvas bag. Not large, but heavy as the years that had clung to her throughout her life, and her eyes, even beneath the sodden brim of her hat, held something that was hard to name. Not hope, not fear, but a fire, smoldering, old. She stopped in front of a group of cowboys sitting around a fire outside the kitchen. The faint smell of bacon mingled with cigarette smoke. Their laughter died when they saw her. One by one, heads turned, curiosity faded as their eyes swept over the strange woman, cold, hard. A man stood, older than the rest, with a salt and pepper beard and eyes like pebbles after a rain. His voice was hoarse, and there was a whiff of alcohol. This camp doesn't take strays. Girl, especially in the winter. She stood up straight, her eyes never leaving his. I'm not stray, she said, her voice even and low. I came to cook. A laugh erupted from the men behind her. One spat aside, smacking his lips. Look at her. She looks more like a girl in a pub down the street than someone who knows how to start a fire. More laughter. But the first man raised his hand, silencing them. He stepped forward, standing so close that their shoe tips nearly touched. He looked down into her eyes, unblinking. You think you can survive here? With that shirt? With those tough words? I know how to keep a fire alive through the night, she said. How to cook moldy flour and cold water. How to turn bones into soup. How to make a man eat every last burnt grain and then ask for more. And no one laughed anymore. A gust of wind whipped by. The fire crackled. The man tilted his head, watching her for a moment longer. He nodded toward the kitchen behind him. 36 men. No real meal in 2 days. The stove is still on. If you want work, prove it tomorrow morning. Oh? She didn't hesitate. I need flour, salt, a dry towel, and a little respect, even if it's just a little. He laughed hoarsely, whether from amusement or contempt. That last one, we'll see. Sell. She passed him without turning. The kitchen door creaked open. In the dim light, the smell of burning oil and cold filled her nostrils. But she didn't hesitate. She entered. The door closed behind her, blocking all eyes. Behind the fire, a man stood still from start to finish. Not smiling, not speaking. Dark cloak, hood pulled down over his eyes. Only the part of his chin that showed through the shadow was sharp as a knife. Caleb. He looked after her, not like the others. Not judging, just looking, as if trying to remember something long ago. They had met before. She didn't know his name. He wasn't sure she would recognize him. But their eyes, for a moment, met, like a small crack in the cold wall that had just formed. May, the woman no one expected, had just entered the heart of the harshest land, with only a bag, a declaration, and eyes that did not know how to lower their heads. The story began from there, not with guns or blood, but with silence, with fire, and with a woman who asked for no mercy, only to do what she did best, cook a meal in the middle of a snowstorm. And someone under the brim of that hat had begun to listen, even if he did not admit it, even if he did not understand why. But Caleb Stone had seen her, not as men see women, but as someone who had waited a long time to see again what he had missed. The Montana sky was as gray as the day she arrived. But no one looked at her now, as if counting the mud stains on the hem of her skirt. They still didn't talk much, didn't call names. But the looks were less piercing. Maybe it was the food. The first morning, she lit a stove from the cold ashes, cracked ice over the top of the water bucket, sliced bacon into thin slices, and made unleavened dough. The smells of smoke, burning fat, and boiling coffee mingled in the small kitchen, lingering in her hair, her sleeves, and every corner of the damp wood. It wasn't a fancy meal, but when the spoon tapped on the plate, she knew she had begun to accomplish the first thing: get them to eat without complaining. The second day, someone asked, "What's with the coffee?" But not in a sarcastic tone. The third day, they sat down at the table earlier, nodding silently as she put the stew on the stove. No one complimented them, but they ate. Clean. She didn't expect compliments. She needed something else. A foothold, however small, and she was digging invisible nails into the cold earth to hold it. Caleb said nothing, not a word since she entered the kitchen. But every morning, when she stepped barefoot onto the cold floor to light the stove, there was wood stacked neatly by the stove, water in the bucket, dry rags hanging on hooks. No one said whose, but she knew. He came before dawn, when the kitchen was still dark, when everyone was still asleep. He didn't ask, he didn't demand, he just did what needed to be done, and then left, and always left a trace. Not footsteps, but the warmth that lingered in the doorknob, in the cup she hadn't poured yet that someone had touched. She didn't say thank you. He didn't need to hear. Everything happened in silence, like two people writing letters to each other with actions without words, a language of people who have lost faith in words, but still keep the fire in their hearts. In the evening, when everyone had finished eating, she washed each pot with cold water, picking off the burnt bits stuck to the bottom of the pan as if she were peeling off the crust of her own heart. Caleb came again, never went too far into the kitchen. He just stood in the doorway, sometimes nodding, sometimes saying nothing. But every night, one afternoon, it was freezing. The snow was falling heavier than usual. She carried a bucket of water from the well, her hands shaking with cold. A thin layer of ice covered the farmyard. When her foot slipped, the bucket of water spilled, the ice shattering like broken glass. May fell hard, her back hitting the ground, her left hand instinctively supporting herself but twisting. Pain shot up, straight into her chest. She gritted her teeth, trying not to cry. No one should see her weak, not now. But someone's arm was around her shoulders before she could get up. Warm, strong, silent. Caleb. He said nothing, just pulled her up, one hand at her elbow, the other behind her back, guiding her toward the kitchen. Slow, steady steps. She could feel his breathing. Not fast, not hurried. As if he did this every day. When he reached the kitchen door, he let go. Not too fast, but enough to keep her distance. She turned to look back, about to say something. But he had already turned, walking toward the stables. Didn't ask if she was hurt. Didn't look back. She stood there for a long time. The pain in her wrist faded under another pain, a nameless feeling. For the first time in years, she felt herself being lifted without being pulled down. Touched, without fear. That night, she sat by the stove, wrapping her wrist in a warm towel. On the table was a slice of cornbread she'd left. Next to an untouched cup, she poured some black coffee. Strong. As usual, no one came in. But when she went out for a few minutes to get more firewood, the cup was half empty, No need to ask. She began to leave an extra portion of coffee, a piece of cake, at first unconsciously, then deliberately, and every night. When she returned, that part was gone, as if someone had walked through her dreams to pick up the presents. Once, she saw fresh shoe prints on the doorstep. Then she smiled, softly, like someone who had just heard their name, remembered correctly. Caleb didn't say much, didn't leave letters, didn't make promises, but she understood. Silence was also a kind of commitment, a commitment not bound by words, but by a small fire that burned steadily, day after day. A commitment of someone who had been silent for too long, but now didn't want to turn away again. And on a winter night, under the flickering fire in the small kitchen, the two people began a dance without music, without rhythm, without name, just small, regular, sincere actions. A gesture, a look, a slice of cake placed in the right place, and another crack, thinner than the cold wind, had just formed in the wall of their hearts. No one spoke, but everyone heard it, like the crackling of fire, small, persistent, impossible to ignore. Rumors begin as they do in places where winter lasts too long, in small, casual whispers, and then grow when no one bothers to quell them. That night, a cowboy named Red Callahan came back from town, his saddlebags full of provisions, but his mouth heavier than any sack of flour. He sat down by the fire, took out his flask, and began to joke in a tone that had something as sour as rust. "I saw her," he said, without using her name, "in Rose Bell, in Billings. Not a nice place." "Oh," laughter broke out from some of the drunks. A few fell silent, but no one stopped him. "She cooks." "Sure," Red continued, "but anyone who's been to Rose Bell knows nobody there does just one thing." "Oh," his words fell on the camp like sparks on dry thatch. Slow, soft, but enough to ignite something smoldering. The next morning, when May brought out her coffee as usual, she felt different. There were no welcoming glances. No one looked directly at her. The murmured thanks from before were gone, replaced by the cold clatter of spoons against plates. One person set his bowl on the table instead of handing it out. Another ate only half his cake and got up early. No one said anything, but she was used to the silence. It wasn't respect, it was judgment. She'd lived it before, at Rose Bell, in other places too, places where the truth wasn't important, just rumors that were easier to swallow. Caleb heard it too, but unlike the other times, he didn't turn away. That afternoon, as Red sat smoking a cigarette and made another half-joking remark about a prostitute cooking leftover porridge, Caleb stepped forward without warning. His punch carried no threat, just the weight of 3 years of silence, of a rage that was not loud, but that had built up long enough to be uncontrollable. Red collapsed to the ground, bleeding from her mouth, her eyes wide. "What the?" Caleb didn't answer. He just stood there, fists clenched, shoulders heaving. No one laughed. No one intervened. Everyone was silent. May watched it all from behind the kitchen door. She didn't scream, didn't run. She just stood there, like she had stood at Rose Bell when. Caleb had also stood watching, had also said nothing, had also been silent, except that he hadn't done anything. That night, May didn't sleep. She folded her clothes, folded her towels, took her recipe book from under the dresser, and stuffed it into her bag. Everything she had brought with her when she came here fit into an old cloth bag. It was the same when she left. But there was one thing that was different this time she left, not because she was being chased away, but because she refused to stay in a place where eyes turned away from her just because of a name from the past. She left the camp in silence. Before dawn, no one saw her off. No one kept her company. At the small inn in town, she rented a place to sleep with her meager savings. The wind blew through the crack in the door. The tea quickly cooled in her hands, and her heart was heavy. She did not open her notebook right away. Everything was still broken inside. It was not until the third night, when she was flipping through the back page to write down a new recipe she had learned from her roommate, that she discovered a folded piece of paper nestled between two blank pages. The paper was not fragrant. There was no title, just a few lines of handwriting in a smudged pencil. Uneven, as if the writer were not used to writing for others to read. If I were anyone else, I would have knelt down and wiped the floor that day, to show people that you are not short. They are just standing in the wrong place to look at you. And I was standing in the wrong place, standing in the dark and silent, like all cowards. Well, but since you walked into that kitchen, I've seen the fire I lost. You don't ask for forgiveness. I just want you to know, when you walked into my fire, it was the first time I felt warm. Well, Caleb. And she read it over and over. Each time, the words seemed hotter, clearer, and a little more painful. There was no specific apology, no plea to come back. But there was something harder to say than forgiveness, an admission. Her heart didn't melt. Not immediately, but something began to soften, like an old scar touched for the first time by a clumsy hand. She folded the paper and put it in her left pocket, next to her heart. For the first time in many nights, she slept peacefully. At Stone River Farm, Caleb sat alone in the empty kitchen. She had been gone for 3 days. No one had replaced her. The dirty pots were still there. The kitchen was cold. The men ate dry noodles. No one laughed. But the coldest thing was not the errand, was her unspoken absence. He did not stop her. He did not say a word when he saw her walk across the yard, bag on her shoulder, as straight as the day she first arrived. He did not hold her back, because he knew the words that kept a woman like her were not words. They must be actions, and sometimes the right silence. Now, he sat before the notebook she had left. There was nothing inside but neat handwriting, simple recipes. But on the last page, where the paper had been, he had put a short line, this time not in pencil. If you don't come back, take these recipes with you. They'll need another. Varme stuv. He closed the notebook and rested his arms on the table. The wind whistled outside, carrying with it the groaning of wood. But he did not shiver, because even though the fire in the stove had died, the fire in his chest had burned again, even if it was late, and sometimes better late than never. The little hillside town was unremarkable. A few old lumber shops, a red dirt road, and a station where trains had stopped for too long. But one spring morning, people began to notice a newly renovated wooden house at the turnoff of the trail, where the old horse-changing station had been. A sign hung above the porch, in rustic hand-carved letters, May's Table. No one asked where May came from. No one cared. She didn't say, but every day, from the small kitchen behind the shutters, the smell of pies, bacon, and early coffee wafted through every crack in the door, filling the air as if the place had always belonged to her. The shop wasn't crowded, not flashy. There were just a few long wooden tables, rows of neatly stacked salt and pepper shakers, and a small counter by the window, where May kneaded dough and smiled at passers-by. Every morning, before opening the door, she dropped a few coins from the previous day's sales into an old tin jar labeled Dreams. The jar was for the girls she taught to bake on the weekends, for those who had nothing but bright eyes. Then one day, Caleb showed up. No explanation, no awkwardness, just a man knocking on the door as she was flipping pancakes on the stove. He stood there, in an old shirt, holding a bunch of freshly picked herbs. No invitation. No questions. She looked at him for a few seconds, then tilted her head slightly. Come in. Don't let the basil wilt. And sigh. From that day on, every morning, he raked the back garden, planted onions, trimmed eggplants, watered the mint bushes. In the hot afternoon, he covered the porch. In the cold afternoon, he sawed and stacked the firewood. He didn't say much, just like before, but this time he wasn't silent because he was afraid he didn't need to. Occasionally, customers asked about the restaurant, about her. An old man tapped his pipe on the table and said, "You cook like you've lived your whole life in the kitchen." May just smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. I used to cook for people who were so drunk they couldn't remember my name. Now I cook for people who look me in the eye. That's enough. Okay. And it was enough. For Caleb, a silent look each morning as she leaned over to refill her coffee was a greeting. For her, the slice of cake placed gently on his plate each afternoon when he returned from the garden was his way of saying, "I miss you." They understood those unspoken words better than any flowery words. Their wedding was not a big affair. No fireworks, no crowds of guests, just an old oak tree in the meadow. 2 witnesses, a greffe pasteur, and a dress she'd made herself from coarse cloth. Trimmed with a blue ribbon Caleb had found in an old drawer, he wore the shirt he'd worn the day she'd fallen on the ice. The buttons still a little loose but clean and neat. When the pastor finished his final words, Caleb didn't kiss her hand, didn't kiss her forehead. He took an old handkerchief from his pocket, just a worn piece of soft cotton, clumsily embroidered with a red word, "Forgiven." He tied it gently around her wrist, not too tightly, as if he was afraid that if he tied it too tightly she would leave again. She looked at him, her eyes no longer suspicious, only tears and a slight tremble in her lower lip. "Thank you," she said softly. He shook his head, holding her hand tighter. "No," he replied. "Thank you for staying. When I gave you 100 reasons to leave." Leave. People often say that love begins with the first glance, with a burning passion. But for them, it begins with a cold stove, a slice of cake, a cup of coffee left out, and someone who no longer has the courage to speak, but has the courage to stay. As the years passed, the little restaurant became a resting place for the weary, for children running in the fields, for men who used to shout but now just nodded silently when receiving a bowl of hot soup from her hands. Every Saturday, the girls from the neighborhood gathered at the back door. May taught them to knead dough, to knead bread, to tell them that to know if the oil was hot enough, drop in a little dough. It rose. It was ready. She told stories while stirring the pot, but never spoke of the past, unless asked. And if someone asked, she would say this: "The past is what makes you a better cook, but it doesn't define you." Or, Caleb still planted, still talked to the basil, still cut tomatoes, as if learning from his first clumsy attempts. But when he looked up at the porch, where May was drying the salt shaker, there was never a shadow in his eyes. Their life was not glamorous. No movies. But it is real life, where people know they were wrong. I know how to fix it, and know how to love without forcing anyone to forget anything. Just be gentle enough so that people no longer hurt when they remember. And in a town where no one mentions Rose Bell, no one asks who Caleb is. No one talks about the past. That little diner is still lit every night. The smell of baked goods and words of thanks that don't need to be spoken. A full life, not because the past is gone, but because now they have a place to go. Even if the fire in the kitchen goes out, or winter comes back. If you've come this far, you've probably had a scar in your heart. Like May, like Caleb. Maybe you've been silent when you should have spoken up, missed someone, or been judged by something you can't erase. But this story isn't just about loss or mistakes. It's about how people choose to stand up, choose to look at each other with new eyes, and choose to stay even when there are 100 reasons to leave. If you believe that everyone deserves a second chance, subscribe to follow stories like this, honest, touching, and full of life. And if you see a part of yourself in this story, leave a comment, share your feelings, or send it to someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes, just one story is enough to warm a long winter.